The Wu Lin's invasion of Heathmoor was sudden and fierce. The three factions had not been prepared for the sudden attack of the Chinese warriors. Early victories against Valkenheim, the Mire, and Ashfeld allowed many Wu Lin militias and warbands to claim territories and establish a foothold. However, their early leads didn't last long, and the Wu Lin were put on the back foot by the powerful counterattacks led by the Heathmoor residents. The Wu Lin would establish Chiang Pass, a fortification to act as a solid sentinel against the forces of Heathmoor. But even with this fortification, the Wu Lin still struggled to maintain solid footholds in Heathmoor beyond its wall. With that said, there were some towns and outposts the Wu Lin established that they have managed to maintain for years, be they through a tactical brilliance, clever hiding and foraging, or through very unlikely alliances. One such alliance is known as the Lin Accord, established between two lions who both placed their honor on the line in the most unlikely of ways. One of these lions was Zhao Wei. In Ashfeld, there was a modest castle known as the Royal Citadel, which had long been the seat of the Royal Legion. Once a large and powerful legion that predated the Iron Legion, now it was only a small force of only 200 or 300 sworn knights. When the Wu Lin invaded, the Royal Legion had sent their forces out to fight them, only to return and discover that a warband of the Wu Lin had settled in a small town just north of their castle. Intent to dislodge these foreigners, the lawbringer who commanded the Royal Legion, Sir Dalton of Westlake, rallied his men to engage the enemy. However, the battle never took place, as Dalton and his men approached. Waiting to meet them was an old Zhongjun and a young woman, easily in her early teens, wearing armor far too big for her. Both bowed formally to Dalton, and the Zhongjun even placed his forehead to the ground. His name was Huang Gai, a lieutenant in the Wu Lin, whose commanding general had died during the conflict. Given an ad hoc promotion to general due to the death, he was now in command of this meager Wu Lin force. Such as it was, the soldiers in his band numbered only around 35 to 40, barely a threat to Dalton's Royal Legion. The rest of their forces had been devastated by a surprise ambush by the Vikings of Valkenheim, and they had only just managed to escape into Ashfeld into safety. There were civilians with them, blacksmiths, merchants, and tailors, Wu Lin innocents who had no part in this war. They had believed the town abandoned, and believed it would make a place to rest, rebuild, and possibly settle. Dalton was uncertain about this idea. Certainly Huang Gai's small militia was no match for his force, so even if they attempted to rebel, he could handle them quite easily, but he had little desire to raise his weapons against innocent people. But then his eyes turned to the girl standing beside Huang Gai, and he inquired about her. Huang Gai explained and offered an introduction. Her name was Zhao Wei. Her brother had been one of the many who died in the battles prior, and now she was determined to wear his armor, use his sword, and defend this militia with her life, becoming a Tiandi herself. However, Huang Gai explained that she wasn't quite certain as to what being a Tiandi meant, for she had nothing to swear herself to. There was nothing worth swearing itself to. And though Huang Gai had made many excuses for her, claiming he had urged her not to be here, and had begged her to behave and not live the life of a soldier, she did not heed this order. Dalton was impressed by her devotion. Despite her standing there shivering with fear and apprehension, her face held the same stern staunchness that he would expect from one of his own men. Dalton agreed to allow the Wu Lin to remain in this town for the time being, but he would have his men supervise them for a time to ensure that there was no wrongdoing or underhanded tactics being played. As the next season passed, no ill news came from the town the Wu Lin now called Xilin, the Lion's Forest, in honor of the Royal Legion, whose symbol was a lion. In fact, the people of Xilin showed hospitality and respect to the Knights of the Royal Legion, who came by to inspect their holdings regularly. However, the soldiers often told Dalton of this staunch woman who stood guard at the gate almost every day they came. She never hurt them or said a foul word, but she never wavered from her post in her defense of the town. It was Zhao Wei, the ever-vigilant sentinel. Dalton was again intrigued. But curiosity about the girl grew to a head when, in the middle of winter, word came that a samurai attack was being launched at his border, and not only was his castle at risk, but Xilin was as well. Knowing the small militia of Xilin was still getting back on its feet, he dedicated 80 of his finest knights to go offer protection to the town, and he then turned his attention back to defending his own people. The battle with the samurai was ferocious and hard fought, but in the end, Dalton's soldiers came out on top. Considering how useful the artillery was of the royal citadel, it made the battle much easier to win. With the samurai marauders in retreat, he turned his attention to Wu Lin and ordered his army to go and reinforce the town. But when he arrived, to his surprise, the samurai attackers there had already been turned back. His soldiers relayed to him what had taken place. Upon their arrival, the town was already fighting back the samurai, and at the head of them was Xiaoway, her sword flashing in the morning sun and her movements as graceful as a butterfly's dance. She had killed no less than 3 Orochi guard and even a massive Shugoki. Dalton inspected the damage and looked over the dead, pleased to see casualties so low. He commended the skill and defensive abilities of the Wu Lin and offered his praise especially to Xiaoway, whom his men had praised. And in reply, Xiaoway bowed her head and cupped one hand over the other in a sign of respect. Huang Gai explained that this was her way of showing gratitude. She could not speak the common tongue yet, but she understood his words and their meaning enough to know he was grateful. Dalton was very pleased with this and instructed his legion to assist in rebuilding Wu Lin. However, his advisors continued to urge caution on this matter. Indeed, the Wu Lin warriors had aided the Royal Legion this day, but their enemy had been samurai, plus the samurai had attacked them directly. What would happen the day they were not in danger? Or worse, what would happen when the enemy was their own people? Would they stay true to the Royal Legion, or would they side with the enemy? Dalton contemplated this warning and took it to heart, but did not act for or against anything as of yet. His eyes glanced once more to Wu Lin and its warriors, and to Zhao Wei. 2 years passed before the Royal Legion was pulled into another major conflict, but it would be one of the most legendary making. An Iron Legion scout came riding into the Royal Citadel with news. A Wu Lin warband calling itself Tian Ming had come to lay claim to the lands of the Royal Legion. Their general, a Zhan Hu named Mu Yang, had already laid waste to a small Iron Legion outpost and was demanding the immediate surrender of the Royal Citadel. Dalton was concerned by this news, but even more concerned about what Wu Lin would do. He sent a letter to Huang Gai demanding to know where he stood in this conflict, but no answer would come before Mu Yang and his warband arrived on the large hill overlooking the valley. Dalton had no time to debate the matter and mustered his army to meet the enemy. However, Mu Yang had no intention of waiting for terms of surrender. He was already sending his soldiers forward to place pressure on the weary lawbringer. Dalton rushed to muster his defenses, until he saw something he did not expect to see. Riding out on horseback, wind at her back, was a figure wielding a Dao sword. The fields of barley and grain that her horse rode through bowed at her coming, and the air seemed to sing as the sun reflected light off her Dao. She was older now, her armor fit her more neatly, and her cape flowed behind her like a battle flag. It was Zhao Wei, riding forward towards the Wu Lin forces. The Tian Ming were shocked, wondering who this lone Tiandi was riding towards them. Mu Yang, believing her to be an ally, rode out towards her, until she waved her sword above her head, and with a furious cry she swung her Dao and struck Mu Yang off his horse. She then roared to the heavens like a victorious lion, and from out of Wu Lin's gates charged Huang Gai and his small militia. The Wu Lin warriors had come to buy time for Dalton to muster his artillery and defenses. While his own men continued to load catapults, he could not pull his eyes away from the sight before him. The Wu Lin fought their own with no less vehemence and determination than any other foe, and no warrior shone as brightly as Zhao Wei, who danced among the damned and slaughtered with a tenacity that left him feeling shivers. His mind thought back to the young teenage girl he saw in the oversized armor of her brother, bowing to him, fearful yet staunch and devoted. Now she was a woman, and she was fighting on his behalf. He quivered with surprise and shock as a Tiandi and 2 Zhongjun bore down on her with a Shaolin at their back. Standing alone against the 4 enemies, she dodged in and out of their strikes as a serpent through grass. Her blade flashed and crashed against theirs, her mighty foot kicking one Zhongjun back with enough force he was impaled on the weapons of his comrades. The Shaolin foolishly swung his staff too fast at her as she raised her blade to cut the wood in half. She finished the swing and took his head off from his shoulders. The last Zhongjun made a mad slash with his guandao to cleave her in half. Raising her hand, she grabbed the warrior's wrist and threw it aside as she thrust her palm into his chest and forced him backwards. She then jumped in the air, spinning in a rotation that brought her sword across his face twice, before finishing with a punch to his neck so forceful Dalton could feel the pain in his own throat. As the Zhongjun sank to his knees, struggling to breathe, the final Tiandi rounded on her. He screamed something in Chinese that Dalton could not understand, and the two began a duel. He was skilled, but so was Zhao Wei. They danced about each other, swords swinging, twirling, finding armor and air in equal measure. It was as if they were two dancing dragons, circling each other, slashing and cutting at one another, seeking an opening. And then, to Dalton's surprise, when the opponent made a wide swing, Xiaoway ducked the strike, and then taking a stance like a warden, she shoulder charged and knocked the Tiandi back several paces. She had put into practice moves she'd seen his knights perform in battle, and it began to dawn on Dalton just how much this girl had been absorbing by observing this land and him. Without a moment's hesitation, she leapt into the air and brought her Dao down, cleaving the Tiandi's head down the middle. She kicked the defeated off, and turned her attention back to the battle. With his artillery finally ready, Dalton gave the order and hell was unleashed on Mu Yang and his Tian Ming forces. The Wu Lin, already familiar with the artillery power of the royal citadel, pulled back swiftly. All except Zhao Wei, who was too thick in the battle to be able to withdraw. Dalton saw her as the flaming stones and rubble rained down in her direction, and yet she never ceased her fighting. The crashing of the hunks of death only acted as backdrop to this furious slaughter she was unleashing on the Tian Ming. She stood amongst death and carnage like a conquering hero, a lioness among sheep. With the Tian Ming finally defeated, Dalton invited the surviving Wu Lin army into his castle. There he beheld them as he sat on his throne. Huang Gai and his militia, of course, many looking worse for wear, with only 12 men left to their name. And amongst them was Zhao Wei herself. Her armor was damaged, her sword bent and nearly broken from repeated use, and yet her face filled with the same staunch and determined expression she'd worn as a child. "My thanks," he said to them, "are not merely enough. You had the opportunity to side with our enemies, and had you, our victory today would not have been sure. Why then did you attack your own people?" Huang Gai spoke first. "We were not sure at first what we would do when we received your warning letter. Some of us wished to join Mu Yang and return to the arms of the Wu Lin. But it was Zhao Wei who decided our course for us." His eyes and Dalton's fell on the warrior woman. "Zhao Wei?" Dalton asked her. Zhao Wei bowed her head and spoke in that unfamiliar tongue. Huang Gai listened to her until she finished, and then he smiled and faced Dalton. "She say, family is not what you are born to. They are the ones who love you. The Wu Lin sent my brother to die and did not come for us when he was gone. When we were alone and without a home, it was not the Wu Lin who welcomed us. When the winters came and the samurai harassed our new home, it was not the Wu Lin who helped us rebuild or defend our home. You have loved us, and so the choice was clear. You are our people, not them. Wu Lin belongs to the Royal Legion, and Zhao Wei fights for the Royal Legion." Dalton rose to his feet at her words and placed both hands on her shoulders. "Yours is an honor like no other, and I shall do your people honor in turn. Henceforth, I extend my citadel to you, Zhao Wei. You will be likened a daughter to me, and all I have is yours. I declare this child my heir." No voice in the Royal Legion or the Wu Lin rose up in protest. No smile turned to shock or misery. All felt joy at the announcement, and the young woman Zhao Wei found herself trembling as tears rolled down her face, as she was embraced in the arms of a man whom she would learn to call father. Asheville was rocked to the core to learn of the lioness from the east who had earned the love and respect of Dalton of Westlake. This woman who would, in time, own her own land in Asheville. Though never forsaking her Tiandi title, she was devoted to Dalton, to the Royal Legion, and to the Wu Lin. Not a knight, and more than a militia warrior. She was Tiandi, and had found what she was devoted to. By heaven and earth, a lioness of the Royal Legion.